It is my honor and pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker. Kaitie Joudeuil grew up in our midst as part of our Rideau Park family, sharing her talents and her friendship with us. Kaitie is now a doctoral scholar at Queen's University, specializing in political theory and Canadian politics. Kaitie wrote an article about how we as settlers live respectfully with Indigenous peoples, given our past mistakes and broken promises. And it was an article that was then picked up by the National Post, and one of my United Church colleagues posted it in our Facebook feed. I read the article and thought it was wonderful, but I never looked at who wrote it. Clearly, we have a lot we can learn from her work as we look at our language and our approaches to reconciliation. So welcome, Kaitie. It's nice to have you back.
My name is Kaitie, and I am a settler of French, Irish, and Scottish ancestry. I first heard this introduction on an episode of CBC's White Coat, Black Art that confronted anti-Indigenous racism in Canada's healthcare system. Sitting at my parents' kitchen table in December 2016, I listened as the host, Dr. Brian Goldman, and two of his guests introduced themselves as white settlers. As one guest explained, identifying as a white settler marked the difference between her experience as a Canadian and that of an Indigenous person. She did not have to worry about racism in the emergency room. In fact, she could live her life without thinking about race at all. Many Canadians dislike being labeled settlers. They view the term as unfairly laying blame. They have not displaced Indigenous peoples, nor did they choose to be born here. However, as Métis author Chelsea Vowell explains in her book, Indigenous Rights, a guide to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit issues in Canada, building healthier relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada requires dialogue. And dialogue requires terminology by which we can refer to one another that reflects the differential impacts of our shared history. As a white scholar studying territorial rights, I see my status as a settler as part of being Canadian. It is not an accusation, but a reality of living on unceded Indigenous lands. It is a recognition that the benefits Canadians enjoy are built on the denial of Indigenous nations' rights to self-government on their land according to their own laws and governance structures. And it comes with a responsibility to build meaningful relationships with Indigenous peoples and nations on our shared land. In this talk, we will do three things. First, we will talk about the importance of settler identity. Second, we will talk about what it means to be responsible for building mutually respectful relations with Indigenous peoples. And finally, we will talk about an important part of this responsibility, giving land back to Indigenous nations. The term settler generally refers to non-Indigenous people who or whose ancestors settled on Indigenous land. Recently, however, the discussion of settler identity has become more nuanced to recognize the different ways groups are impacted by and participate in systems of oppression. Chelsea Vowell, for example, defines settlers as the non-Indigenous peoples living in Canada who form the European-descended socio-political majority. Settlers are one of three groups of non-Indigenous peoples in Canada, along with non-Black people of color and Black people. All three groups have responsibilities to dismantle colonial structures and to build healthy relationships with Indigenous peoples. However, separating them recognizes that each group is connected to colonialism in different ways. Many people of color, for example, have come to Canada because of colonial oppression elsewhere. Likewise, many Black Canadians are descended from slaves who were stolen from their lands and communities and brought to North America by force. Members of both these groups often do not experience the same benefits as white or white-passing Canadians. These categories, however, are not fixed. Some Black and racialized Canadians find the term settler helpful to recognize the ways they benefit from and participate in the ongoing colonization of Indigenous peoples in Canada. I use Vowell's definition of settlers because it emphasizes that these benefits are not uniform. The European-descended socio-political majority, of which I am a part, is the primary intended beneficiary of colonialism. So how are settlers responsible? We often think about responsibility in terms of liability. Someone is responsible when they cause or fail to prevent harm. Political theorists call this kind of responsibility backward-looking, because the focus is to identify the person, people, or groups that caused the harm and to hold them accountable for doing so. When settler Canadians think about Canada's responsibility to Indigenous peoples, many think in terms of backward-looking responsibility. This is also how responsibility is understood in the public discourse on reconciliation. Colonialism is perceived as a dark chapter in Canada's history for which settlers must make amends. Prime Minister Joudeuil, for example, has repeatedly acknowledged Canada's obligation to right historic wrongs and close gaps between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. As Yellowknives Dene scholar Glenn Coltard argues, however, if we think about reconciliation as only dealing with the past, we allow colonialism to continue. He writes, "In settler colonial contexts such as Canada, reconciliation itself becomes temporally framed as the process of individually and collectively overcoming the harmful legacy left in the wake of past colonial abuse, while leaving the present structure of colonial rule largely unscathed." Colonialism is not only in the past. It persists through government policies and institutions, and in the denial of the rights of Indigenous peoples and nations. The final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls found that Canada's past and current policies, actions, and inactions towards Indigenous peoples is genocide, as defined in international law. Instead of thinking about responsibility as laying blame, we should think of responsibility as forward-looking, oriented towards ending injustice. Individuals can be responsible because they benefit from institutions that are unjust. They can be responsible because their actions contribute to social processes that systematically privilege some groups at the expense of others. They can also be responsible by virtue of their membership in a political collective like a state. Forward-looking responsibility emphasizes our interconnectedness with others and the importance of building good relationships between communities. How we think about responsibility also matters because it shapes the way we take responsibility for the wrongs we have committed. The United Church of Canada acknowledges that non-Indigenous Christians have an ongoing responsibility to make reparations. But what does it mean to make reparations? Reparations for injustice can take three forms. The first is recognition. We can apologize. Recognition is an important step to restore dignity to individuals and communities because it recognizes that what happened to them was wrong. The second is compensation. We can give victims something to make amends for our actions. Most acts of reconciliation in Canada have taken these two forms. Both the United Church and the federal government have issued apologies to residential school survivors. Both are signatories to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which provides financial compensation to residential school survivors. The United Church also has a healing fund, which supports healing projects by and for survivors and their families. Sometimes, however, apology and compensation are insufficient. This brings us to the third form of reparations, restitution, to return that which was stolen. Land restitution is an essential part of Indigenous peoples' demands for justice, but is often ignored in official discourse on reconciliation. This is because we think of responsibility as backward-looking. Many Indigenous lands were stolen long ago, and those responsible are long dead. However, if we think of responsibility as forward-looking, we understand that land restitution is a crucial step to building respectful relationships with Indigenous nations. For many settler Canadians, land-back discussions generate anxiety and discomfort. But land back does not mean the removal of all non-Indigenous peoples from North America. As Haudenosaunee scholar and activist Taika Alfred explains, when we say to the settlers, give land back, are we talking about them giving up the country and moving away? No. When we say give land back, we're talking about settlers demonstrating respect for what we share, the land and its resources, and making things right by offering us the dignity and freedom we are due and returning our power and land enough for us to be self-sufficient. Land back is about restitution, the return of jurisdictional control to Indigenous nations. In legal and political philosophy, jurisdiction is the right to make and enforce laws over a geographic area. It also often includes control over the extraction and development of natural resources. When we talk about restitution in Canada, we are mostly talking about Crown land, which is owned by the federal and provincial governments. Crown land makes up 89% of Canada's land, as compared to the 11% that is privately owned. Indigenous land rights in Canada are recognized under Section 35 of the Constitution as Aboriginal title. These are special rights that flow from Indigenous nations' political sovereignty. Aboriginal title, however, is not the same as restitution. This is because Canada has ultimate legal authority, or Crown sovereignty, over all land within its borders. Indigenous nations' jurisdictional rights are protected in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, in treaties negotiated with the British Crown and the Canadian government, and in UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Canada has ignored many treaty obligations, yet treaties are integral to land restitution. They recognize Indigenous nations as separate but equal, with their own constitutional orders and governance structures who share geographic space with the Canadian state. Land restitution also has larger positive implications. A UN report on biodiversity, for example, found that Indigenous jurisdictions can mitigate biodiversity loss because Indigenous practices emphasize land restoration and sustainability. This is crucial to mitigate the climate crisis. It is important to note that Indigenous nations do not need settler consent to exercise their jurisdiction over land, and many do so despite violent resistance from the Canadian state. Ending this violence, however, requires settlers to recognize their responsibility to support restitution. As we are reminded in the Indigenous Circle's calls to the Church, justice in land matters must be about reparations and not only apologies. Reconciliation is not just heads and hearts that feel bad, but hands and feet that do tangible good. Returning land to Indigenous nations is one way that we can do tangible good. Building just relations with Indigenous nations will require significant political and economic transformation. It requires land restitution. This transition will be difficult and uncomfortable, but we have a responsibility to embrace it. The first step is to critically engage with the meaning of being settler Canadian. One way to do this is to learn about whose land you live on and the history of that land. Rideau Park is located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. What are your responsibilities to the Algonquin Anishinaabe and to the land as shared residents of their territory? Another important step in this transition is embodied in the TRC's 59th call to action, which calls upon churches to teach their congregations about their role in colonization, the history and legacy of residential schools, and the necessity of apologies to former students, families, and communities. How are you, as members of a community of faith, working to answer this call? What further steps can you take? Finally, you can hold your elected representatives accountable. How are they advancing justice for Indigenous peoples? Are they working to implement the TRC's 94 calls to action, or the calls to justice from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls? What are they doing to defend Indigenous land rights in your community? On Orange Shirt Sunday, we reflect on our responsibility to build respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples and nations. But meaningful change is impossible unless we act on this responsibility every day. Only then can we build a better future, one that all sovereign nations on this land can celebrate. Thank you.